Greetings from CABE. I'm Nicole Anderson, and I want to welcome all of you equity warriors and warriorettes to this short presentation around our educational equity journey. I want to say I'm really sad that we can't be together, but the circumstances call for us to meet virtually, so we are going to make this work. And I want you to just sit back, relax, but try to get engaged in a short conversation about our educational equity journey. I first want to just say that I pray that you and your family are doing well, and that despite the circumstances, you are finding time to re-engage with the things that are most important in life. I also want to take some time to acknowledge those students and families who are most vulnerable at this time, where this becomes very challenging and most negatively impacting their lives, as often schools have been the safe haven for our families and students who, again, are most vulnerable. So I want to just acknowledge them now, acknowledge those that are not with us at this time due to the circumstances that we're experiencing globally. But I do want to acknowledge that this is a great opportunity for education to think about doing things a little differently. We've been talking about educational equity for a long time with regards to making systemic change. And I have to say that despite this really unfortunate circumstance, it also is an opportunity for us as educators to shift our thinking around how we deliver instruction, how we assess students, how we meet their needs, considering we have a virtual platform, but we also have a great opportunity to do things very differently. And so I want to take some time today to help you go through this journey as an educational equity leader, understanding that this cannot be a distraction, but this actually has to be an opportunity for us to see our role really coming from out of the woodworks to really create a movement focused around educational equity for kids, considering all children, and I have to say this, all children are impacted by this shift. So we have to think about what is our role now in creating an equitable system for students and families in particular who are impacted the most, but most critically for all kids, because every single kid's needs have to be met. And so we're going to talk about how that looks today, but of course through the lens of our English learner, where we have so many students who fit that description. And so we're going to break down that conversation and really look at what is your role in your educational equity journey. So I want to start our session today with just a quote that's been inspired in me for several years now, and it really speaks to the essence of what I'm going to share today. Educational leaders, we cannot close the educational gaps that we see in our schools if we don't close the one in our minds first. As we think about our educational equity journey, especially in the midst of school closures and some indefinite decisions that are still being literally made as we speak, you may be feeling like this right now as an educator. I'm sure that your experiences are unprecedented and you are being asked to do some things that have been never been experienced before. And so as you think about this work, schools have always been challenging. So I want you again to think about your journey as an educational equity leader and thinking about our work in terms of our mindset shifts that have to happen at this time. Today, I'm going to bring you through a very quick phase of work around an equity leadership framework that I have developed. These 6 phases really help us to stay focused and centered on the work, starting with deepening our belief systems and really looking at self, also understanding diversity and looking at those who may be different and the relationships we have with those who are different. I'm going to take you through several steps around strategies to empower yourself with tools and research to build your capacity to lead equity work. But then we're going to start talking about the concept of being proactive and responsive and having a plan, not just our plan sitting on our shelves, but a plan that is really focused on closing an equity gap. Then we're going to talk about how do you actually implement the work and serving the diverse needs of your community, taking these research-based practices and putting them into action and monitoring and measuring the impact of those. And most critically, actually seeing the work make a difference in closing educational equity gaps. And this is where we talk about systemic change. And these phases of work don't stop, they continue. It is a journey. And so when we talk about leading for equity, you have to think about a framework in doing the work versus being very much focused on the technical work and not considering the adaptive work that has to happen. So this framework really kind of parallels those two as you think about how to do this work in a sequential manner and starting with self first. I want to start with how I've reflected on my own journey, and want to give acknowledgement to my grandfather, who you see here, Mr. Jesse and Bethel. This is actually advertisement marketing tool that I found in my desk a few months back. And this was my grandfather, who was running for the school board in Vallejo Unified School District. And this is way back in 1969, a little before I was born. And so the reason I think about it is my journey really started with him, where he was the first African-American chemist on a place called Mare Island in Vallejo. He was the first African-American school board president. He also was the first African-American CSBA president for California School Boards Association. And he actually has a high school named after him here in Vallejo, California, named Jesse and Bethel High School. So I'm honored to share that with you, because my journey started with the seeds that were planted from someone else, who happened to be my grandfather, and those shoulders that I stand on. And so when I think about that journey, it's important because it is my why. It is how I do this work. It's the lens by which I advocate for kids and support kids. And so I want you to think about your journey. I want you to think about your story. And what is your why? Because when we talk about leading for equity and closing gaps for English learners, we have to start with self first. And so this question that I pose to you is based on thinking about your journey, your cultural identity, who you are, and how you identify, maybe based on your ethnicity, maybe based on your gender. It could be based on a variety of things that often we kind of identify ourselves as. And again, this is the lens by which we do our work. And so as I come to you as an African-American woman, I recognize that the beauty of my story, it absolutely drives my work and how I advocate and how I love students and how I build relationships and everything that I do. But I also recognize that there is a clear boundary that exists as well with regards to the implicit bias that comes with my identity. So I know I have some blind spots. I know I have some boundaries. I know I have some spaces to grow, and that that it impacts how I lead for equity. So this question to you to start off our session is, how does the intersection of your personal and professional identity impact how you lead for equity? And this is a critical question to think about, because as you reflect, and even if you have some paper with you, if you want to write it down, how you would answer this question, because the intersection of who you are, your cultural identity, your personal identity, it absolutely intersects with your professional identity. And so as you make decisions on behalf of students, who you are as a person will absolutely impact how those decisions lay out. So whether you're a school board member, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a principal, no matter your role, you absolutely have to be very cognizant of the fact that this is who you are impacts how you lead for equity. So I want you to just take a moment and just write down how you might respond to this question, and maybe use this as a journaling prompt every day. I've been using it quite often. And what it does is it helps me grow. It helps me go back to really measuring the impact of my work and showing me how my growth has really helped others to grow, and how it actually impacts where I am closing equity gaps on behalf of students. So I just want you to take a moment, think about how you answer this question. How does the intersection of your personal and professional identity impact how you lead for educational equity? So I want you to shift your thinking for a moment as you reflected on that impactful question, and think about, how are we going to lead for equity in this system that hasn't necessarily been designed to be equitable? So as we unpack that, I want you to think about this story and this analogy that comes from an article called The Water System Change. And in this article, it talks about an analogy about a fish swimming along one day when another fish comes up and says, "Hey, how's the water?" The first fish stares back blankly at the second fish and then says, "What's water?" So as you think about that analogy, I want you to think about the system of education as a body of water, where we are the fish swimming in the water. Our students are the fish swimming in this water. And there are conditions that have existed for millions of years. And literally, there are conditions that exist in this system, or this body of water, that haven't always been well for some fish, but then where other fish have actually thrived in this water. And so when you think about the educational system as a body of water, we're going to have to really unpack, what are those conditions that are existing that may not be working well for all fish? And as we are the fish swimming in the water, I want you during this session to think of yourself as the fish jumping out of the water for a moment. And jumping out of the water so that you can take a look at the conditions that exist. So when you jump back in the water, you can have more clarity and you can have more direction on how you're going to address these conditions that aren't working well for all fish. But as you're out of the water, it's sometimes uncomfortable. As we sit and think about our existing conditions right now, as we are, often sitting at home away from our jobs and working in conditions that are very different, the conditions aren't comfortable. It almost feels like we're fish out of water right now, literally. We feel like we can't breathe as well. We feel very uncomfortable. We're flopping around trying to figure this thing out. And so as we get ready to jump back in that water, because we will go back to schools will open again. We know that life will continue. We have a moment in time that is very unprecedented. But I believe that in this moment in time, as we're fish out of the water, that when we jump back in, we will have an opportunity to make a huge difference and have some more clarity on what is going on in this water called public education. So as you think about the system of education, knowing that it wasn't necessarily equitable to begin with, we have to think about why equity gaps exist. And so we all know this. And so I think of it as a recap, because at the end of the day, we're going to have to understand why these gaps exist, remind ourselves over and over so that we don't perpetuate these gaps. I want you to think about this cartoon here and thinking about our educational system and Albert Einstein reminding us that everybody is a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it is stupid. And so when you think about this cartoon and you see all these different animals, and they're looking at the gentleman who's saying, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And we ask students to do these all the time. When you think about the data dashboard, it gives a collection of data that shows us how we measure success for students. And often those measurements are all the same, but yet our students are very different. I want to pull out and highlight the history of public education. Those of you that have seen me do sessions around the history of public education, you've seen the history timeline. It has about 30 facts that talk about history. The one in particular that really has impacted what we do today is one in 1948, where it talks about educational testing services is formed, merging the college entrance examination board, the cooperative test services, that's that infamous ETS system that we think about. This is all in collaboration with our Graduate Records Office, the National Committee on Teacher Examination, and many others with these huge grants from Rockefeller and the Carnegie Foundations. And these testing services continue the work of eugenicists like Carl Brigham, the originator of the SAT, who did research proving that immigrants were feeble-minded. Now, when you think about going back in history and thinking about the concept of immigrants, thinking about what testing looks like, and thinking about, sometimes we talk about culturally biased testing, and we know historically that eugenicists played a role in how we determine who's considered intelligent, who's not. And when you go back in history, you know that eugenicist thinking was really around looking at racial genetics and thinking that some were more inferior than others based on their race. And we know that all of that is not necessarily true, but that became a well-studied concept that then became truth in people's minds. And we as educators grew up with, unfortunately, that system where testing then became a space where we actually used to measure the success of kids. And so when we talk about testing, we have to recognize that historically testing was never designed to show that all kids were brilliant. So we have to be really, really mindful about what we're doing for our students, in particular English learners who are subjected to multiple tests and multiple measurements to share how successful they are in schools. And so I want you to think about identifying some gaps that actually are existing even now. We know that you know your data. And so it's important that you identify some of the new gaps that are now going to be surfaced through this distance learning process, but also through the ways that education is evolving, considering the multiple versions of assessments that we're using for students. So as you think about some of these reflective questions, first is, have a definition of equity. If you don't have a definition of equity, you're going to have to get one, because having this word, which is a very popular word in education, we have to have some commonality around what this language actually means. When we talk about equity, what does it mean? What does it look like, sound like, feel like? And have that collaborative conversation with those that you're working with, including your stakeholders,
like your students and families, who can help you really define what equity actually means. Another reflective question to think about is what equity gaps actually exist in your school district, your school, your county, and the organizations that you are working within. What are those equity gaps? Look at your data and really try to make that assessment. Do all your students have access to the core curriculum? Do your English learners have access to effective EOD instruction? Considering all of the levels of our English learners, knowing that all of them enter at different spaces. We have our newcomers, we have our long-term English learners. We have those who are really in a space of not being reclassified, but on the brink of it. And so they all have different needs. So what do those equity gaps look like? With this distance learning, we have lots of English learners who are now going to be impacted by not having a device. Do they have the one-to-one deployment? Do they have Wi-Fi access? We still know the Williams Act plays a role. Although kids aren't in schools and us looking at facilities, we definitely are looking at the curriculum. And not only do they have access to textbooks, but are they having access to culturally relevant curriculum, which is a very important space. Our school climate data is going to look very different as we think about new equity gaps. I think we're going to have to start talking about social media because we're asking kids to be in this digital space. And so therefore social media, we know that cyberbullying had become an issue, but it may become more of an issue because we're asking kids to be in this digital world. And so we're going to have to look at how are those gaps now going to play out in terms of how we deal with school discipline, how we're going to address the needs of kids considering the circumstances. And then how do you know what those gaps are? You know, what data are you using? You have some quantitative data, obviously, and there's going to be some qualitative data that we're going to have to unpack. Your data dashboard shares a big picture, which I think is a good starting point for those of you that want to kind of know, how do I start this equity journey? Starting with data is important, and using your data dashboard is not a bad idea to really leverage this conversation and move it to the next level. But you're going to have to start collecting some qualitative and quantitative data that is going to really help you unpack what the equity gaps are, because you may think it's one thing, but it could be something else. And then lastly, what data can you actually collect to unpack the needs of your kids? Because equity is about giving kids what they need. So we don't know what kids need, then how do we actually provide those services? So you're going to have to actually collect some real effective data that's going to help you really make those decisions about how you're going to allocate your funds, how you're going to deal with staffing in terms of allocating your high quality staff and effective staff for kids who need it the most. And there are multiple ways to think about doing that. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to really think about what are those new data collection forms that you're going to have to utilize, including those surveys, those interviews, those observations once we get back into school. And really the questions that you're asking are going to be important in how you drive your equity work. The image here on the screen, as you notice, you've all seen this and we've all had a chance to unpack it in many ways, but I want you to continue to think about the visual and how this looks in your school system, that water that you swim in, and thinking about how you unpack the differences and how you get to a place of not just equity, but even liberation. And that's that mindset work. How do we just remove those barriers altogether? So thinking about defining equity, there's a really cool activity I like to do with folks, and I'm going to take a moment to read a poem to you called The Blind Man and the Elephant. And this poem in particular helps you to think about how we're going to unpack this concept of equity, considering there are so many different needs of our students and our stakeholders. And so as you think about The Blind Man and the Elephant, this is a poem that was adapted by John Godfrey Saxe in the 1800s. And I want you to think about how you define equity with regards to this concept of the elephant. It was 6 men of Indostan, to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl, "God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall." The second, feeling of the tusk, cried, "Ho! Who have we here, so very round and smooth and sharp? To me this mighty clear. This wonder of an elephant is very like a spear." The third approached the animal, and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, thus boldly up and spake, "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a snake." The fourth reached out his eager hand and felt about the knee. "What most this wondrous beast is like, is mighty plain," quoth he. 'Tis clear enough the elephant is very like a tree. The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, in the blindness name, can tell what this resembles most. Deny the fact who can, this marveling elephant is very like a fan. The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, then seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope, I see, quoth he, the elephant is very like a rope. And so these men of Indostan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right and all were in the wrong. As you think about the poem, The Blind Man and the Elephant, I want you to just take a moment and think about how these six blind men, which happen to sometimes be like us as educators, we have different perspectives, we have different ways of looking at this elephant. And this elephant may be one of our students. Based on the data, when we look at our data, we can pick any student group. And let's just think about our English learners. You know, each of us as educators, we could be 6 teachers that our English learners are now going through a process of meeting with virtually. We think about all the different perspectives and ways that we see the world, the blind spots we have. And sometimes we don't see the whole picture. We don't have the whole story. And so as we define what equity is for students and what student success is, it's going to be important that we start thinking about, as the blind men, how do we unpack some of those layers that may be blinding us from who kids are and what their needs are. And then also, how do we think about how as blind men that we can come together and have more collaboration, more professional learning that's inclusive around multiple ideas and ways to meet the needs of that elephant. Some might even say that if we talk to the elephant could talk. It would tell you that I'm an elephant. I'm not just a fan. I'm not just a snake. I'm not just a tree trunk, but I'm an elephant. And really listening to our student voices. This is a great opportunity to empower student voice right now. We talk about defining equity. Figure out what equity means to them versus us telling them what it is and what we think it is. Because again, when we go back to our perspective, our identity, our experience as students in school was very different from what our kids are experiencing now. And so we have to think about, again, how do we define equity for our school, for our district, for our county office? This is going to be a very important aspect, especially for our English learners. We know that our English learners have different needs and each one is not the same. And so we have a very complex task now of understanding how to meet the needs of our English learners with an equity lens. And using the Blind and the Elephant poem is one way to help your stakeholders have this conversation. As we continue to think about the blindness, sometimes that blindness refers to our implicit bias and sometimes the stereotypes that are associated with implicit bias. And so giving you just a quick thought about what implicit bias is, I think we all have spent time doing trainings and understanding what that concept means, but it's simply just a way for us to think about our attitudes and our belief systems that are subconscious and really impacted by what we've learned through the concepts of stereotypes, which are false narratives and overgeneralizations about people that sometimes create what we actually think and believe, and then it actually plays out in how we behave. And it's implicit because it's sometimes so subconscious we don't even realize it's happening. And implicit bias absolutely develops, you know, as we're children, we're infants, literally. And so as adults, educators in this space, this is where we really have to continue to interrupt the implicit bias that we all have and start to interrupt those stereotypes that are associated with those student groups that we serve. So as you see in the middle of the screen, you see the student group that often show up in our data dashboard. And often when we do our equity work, these become the groups that bubble up to the top. It's important to think about the work of Dr. Paul Gorski, and he talks about our deficit ideology. And sometimes certain groups that show up on the screen are English learners, our foster youth, our socioeconomically disadvantaged kids, students with disability, our kids who identify as kids of color. Often there's a deficit mindset around that group of children, which comes from our implicit bias. And so we have to constantly interrupt those narratives and see the value and see the strength of each of these student groups. There's a beautiful photo of a young lady named Sonia, and we've done activities around Sonia's story. And Sonia is that English learner who has a very similar story to many English learners, where she shows up in school, great student, always engaged, really enjoys school, a pleasure to be in class. But somehow she gets lost in the system going through elementary school where she doesn't get reclassified. Her needs are not met. Her family doesn't necessarily have the agency to be able to advocate for Sonia because their language is not the same as the primary language at our schools. And Sonia's family only speaks Spanish, and so they don't have the ability to necessarily navigate the system. And the school system hasn't always served Sonia well. Sonia matriculates through, and again, great kid, never in trouble, but somehow in middle school she begins to find that moment where she's losing engagement, and she's starting to see that this system is not working very well. And she actually experienced a situation where her teacher said, hey, you have an assignment where you're gonna have to do an oral presentation in front of your entire class, and that presentation is worth 50% of your grade. And Sonia decides, you know what, I'm just not comfortable with that. So she cuts school for the first time, and then she gets her first referral and is disciplined for that behavior. And Sonia begins to now see a change in her experience in school. Again, she's not reclassified. Sonia gets to about the 10th grade and she shares with her counselor, you know, I think I want to drop out. And when you think about this story and what question mark we put in what happened to Sonia, this is so many of our English learners. And we have to be better as educators in interrupting the barriers that exist for English learners who don't always have a voice, but who have wonderful value they bring, such great gifts, but often because of barriers with language, we often forget that we don't serve their needs in the ways that they need it. So we have to think about, why does that happen? And we know that there are stereotypes associated with English learners. And I ask that you think about being bold and doing this activity with your colleagues, is pull out a T-chart, pull out a chart paper, just write a T. And I want you to write the stereotypes on the left-hand side associated with English learners. And I want you to write the truths associated with English learners on the right-hand side. And I want you to have that discussion about how those stereotypes exist and how we can look at the truths and really help those to interrupt, so that those can now be spaces to help us unpack and kind of peel away those blind spots that are keeping us from serving our English learners in the ways that they deserve, in the ways that they need. We know the English learners show up in almost every district as an equity gap. So this is a great opportunity to really engage in looking at how do we interrupt the stereotypes associated. There's a book called Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele, which is a great resource for you to think about the concept of stereotypes and how they play out in our schools so drastically with regards to the stereotypes that the kids actually know about. They start to hear those and believe those. And once they hear them and believe them, and the narrative has been given so often, that guess what? They start to become just that. And so you see there are many students who you see are brilliant and have great potential, but somehow they're just not fulfilling that. And you have to remember, stereotypes impact them too. It's called stereotype threat. So it's important as we think about our equity journey, our role in interrupting this implicit bias and stereotypes for our kids is very, very important at this time. And so as we conclude, I want to give you a couple of resources to think about as we get to a place of understanding how to address equity in this time, especially with distance learning. So I'm going to give it to you in the context of digital equity, because this is a space where our kids are now having to learn these next couple of months and possibly in the future. And so when we think about equity and student success, it's important that, again, you define equity and define what student success is beyond test scores. So I want to start by just giving you some context around Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you're not sure where to start, Maslow's is where you start. Dr. Jeffrey Duncan Andrade does a great job of helping us understand the research around Maslow's and how to make those connections to closing equity gaps with regards to what students need. And this applies to all kids. It's not just about one set of kids who marks a box in that data. Every single student who comes to our school system, Maslow's applies to them, because this is about human needs, basic needs. Do kids have basic food, shelter, clothing, physical needs met? Start there, have that assessment. Do your kids have that? Especially in this time when we have distance learning, we have so many kids who are vulnerable now who needed that food. And I know we're doing a great job of reaching out and feeding our kids in our communities, but we have kids who are homeless. We have kids who don't have the basic safety needs. There's child abuse that now has been increasing. And so we have to think about how can we do our best to ensure that kids have basic needs at this point. Notice this has nothing to do with test scores, has nothing to do with grades, just has to do with basic needs. When we get to physical needs, how do we think about their self-esteem, their sense of love and belonging, which is a critical space for many kids. When you think about your own journey, what did that look like in terms of you being fully engaged in school because you felt somebody cared about you? You felt that somebody actually understood your physiological needs, psychological needs, I'm sorry. When you talk about belongingness and love, those are important spaces that have to be embedded when we talk about equity for kids. And then lastly, that piece of getting kids to self-actualization, that meeting their full potential. If the basics of Maslow is not in place, kids cannot reach their full potential. And again, we're not talking about test scores, we're talking about kids and their human needs. When we talk about the indicators of equity, and I want you to think about it from a digital context because our kids are in distance learning spaces, I want you to think about the 4 indicators of equity around cultural identity, relevance, relationships, and rigor. And I'm going to give you some context around the technology space because this is where kids are learning now. But these 4 indicators of equity, when they are in place, we see equity gaps close. We see them correlate with achievement going up. We see them correlate with school climate improving, discipline, referrals, suspensions going down. We see relationships improving in many spaces where these are absolutely in place. And so when we talk about the concepts of digital equity, I want to use the ISTE standards, which is the International Society for Technology and Education. Many of you are familiar with those, and often we don't use those and integrate them with our standards through Common Core and our instruction and teaching and learning. But I want to make some connections to cultural identity and how when cultural identity is in place, we look at how kids, where they know who they are, and we spend time actually acknowledging who children are and that they understand and how to build those relationships with others who are different from them. And so in the context of digital equity, we have students using digital tools to connect with learners from a variety of backgrounds and cultures. What a great opportunity right now, engaging them in ways that broaden their mutual understanding and learning. Huge when we talk about cultural identity in this new learning space. We talk about relevance. This is where kids begin to lose engagement because curriculum and school is not relevant for them. Knowing who they are based on their identity. We think about students building knowledge by actively exploring real world issues and problems, developing ideas and theories, and pursuing answers and solutions. This is a great opportunity for relevance to really be ramped up in education now. We talk about relationships, which is huge. We know that having great relationships, student to teacher relationship, student to student relationship, very important. And we can definitely continue to build those in this digital space. When you think about relationships, how it might play out with kids and learning, the students using collaborative technologies to work with others. So having them do peer-to-peer work, working with experts or community members. This is a great way now to connect with community members who have great resources for kids. And then also helping them to examine the issues and problems from multiple viewpoints. That's where relationships get stronger, when we can start to value each other's viewpoints that may be different. And last but not least is rigor. We know that rigor is just a fancy word for high expectation. This also often is what usually is the barrier to kids being successful in schools, is the expectations we have for them, which play into where implicit bias plays into where stereotypes definitely play out in our classrooms for kids. And so when we think about in this space for rigor, this is where students can communicate complex ideas clearly and effectively by creating or using a variety of digital objects such as visualizations, models, and simulations. And so again, this is taking us to that creative place outside of the textbook. And the digital world is absolutely a platform where we can create more rigorous instruction for kids. And so hopefully these 4 indicators of equity will help you to think about how you're making real connections, not just for your English learners, but for all kids, because we know that English learners are embedded into this learning space. But what's great for English learners actually will be great for all kids. So when you think about 4 indicators of equity and think about Maslow's, it's a great space to start and focus your work. And so with that, there's a couple of resources and things to think about around distance learning with an equity lens. I will allow you to access these at a later time through the CABE staff if necessary. But again, thinking about all those spaces right now that you're in around distance learning, communications, alternatives for services, access to devices, Wi-Fi, your teacher capacity. We're going to have to build that professional learning space for our teachers who are also learning a new way to be innovative with virtual instruction, giving effective feedback. having multiple assessments, really monitoring online content. All of this is going to be important in thinking about distance learning with an equity lens. Our parent capacity. We have so many different diverse needs of our families. Some families are very savvy, have the access and resource to help their students, and others don't have it at all. They're at work. Some of our families are in healthcare now, so they're at work every day on behalf of our society and communities to provide wellness for those that are suffering now. And so we have to think about those families aren't at home. So how are we going to build capacity for our families to meet their needs? Thinking about Wi-Fi and bandwidth capacity is going to be very important because so many are going to be on that distance learning platform. What happens when we have a breakdown and need technical support? Your interpretation and translation service is going to be important. How are we using our bilingual tutors? How are we using our written narratives around newsletters? What is the platform for parents to access help? Is there like a 24-hour live chat option? These are some things we have to think about, especially for our English learner families who can't access the language. Social media, we're going to have some guidelines around what that looks like now, because it will be a platform that people use more and more. Assessments, instruction, we're going to have to continue to think about our grading practices. This is a great opportunity to shift our grading practices that usually have never been equitable. And so I even push people to think about a wonderful grading practice that I actually had the opportunity to grow up as a teacher in the world of grading around ABCI, which was an A, a B, or C, and then I was incomplete. And this was at a high school, happened to be Jesse Bethel High School, where, again, named after my granddad. We had a great opportunity to share our philosophy around no child would fail. And so we didn't give D's or F's. If we wanted kids to be college and career ready, we didn't feel that we gave them D's or F's. Giving them D's or F's would show that our belief system was around that they would not fail. So we didn't give those. We gave them an incomplete, and it gave teachers time to work with students to master those core standards and competencies that were necessary. And students still have the opportunity to graduate with the A through G requirement, and also to have an opportunity to go to college, because we know D's and F's aren't accepted in college. So therefore, our mindset was around no kid would fail. So I push some of you to think about that. This is a great chance to start looking at our grading practices changing. Again, culturally relevant curriculum is going to be important. There's so many ways to have supplemental materials in this distance learning phase, and starting to interrupt implicit bias of our children. The imagery, the documentaries, the student-led lessons can now create some culturally relevant space for our kids. And so again, so many resources out there. I'm not going to share them all, but there's so many ways to continue to enrich kids' learning. And so I want you to really be thinking about how are we going to make sure that all kids' needs are met, considering that distance learning creates obstacles for kids, but also great opportunities. And so the call to action is, again, have a definition of equity, and then have a plan. Do you have an equity impact action plan where you actually call out target groups of students? We can talk about our English learners, really pull them out, have targeted actions, measure the impact of those through your policies, your practices, and start thinking about how are you going to systemically replicate those and create a system change, and not throw it out the window when we have a new initiative come, because we know how education is. This is a chance for you to take your LCAPs, take your school level plans, pull a piece of that out, because you know you're not going to be able to do your 200, 300 page plan. It's very hard to implement that work. Pull out your game plan, and I want you to start focusing and targeting a group of students with an equity lens. And if you can focus on them and close that gap, I guarantee you can close the gap for other kids as well. And so again, having a plan of action is very important, being very strategic and focused, staying the course for years to come. And thinking about systemic change, again, there's an article, Water of System Change. During your time, we may have a little more time to read. I actually encourage you to read this article, again, the Water of System Change. It comes with an action plan exercise as well, and it helps you think about the 6 conditions of system change, which go beyond just the technical work of policy, practices, and resources, but it actually pushes you to a place to think about what are the relationships and power dynamics that exist, and also what are the mental models that exist that you're going to have to consider if you want to create systemic change that's going to last. We want our equity work to last, so we have to think about it with the systems lens. And so again, I recommend this article, an action plan exercise for your cabinet, for your teachers, for your principals, anyone who is making decisions around equity. This is a great activity that can take you through months of planning to really help you create systemic change. And so with that, I want to leave you with a video that I would love for you to take time to look at again. I've always shared it. It's Prince E. He has the video called The People versus the School System. I want to ask you to take time to look at this video and really think about how are you going to create systemic change, knowing that we're in a whole new phase of work and that we have students who are like the fish, that we're asking them to climb up a tree. And at the end of the day, that is not what all fish can do. And so I'm going to ask you to take a moment to reflect on this video by Prince E.
Albert Einstein once said, "Everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today on trial we have modern day schooling. Glad you could come. Not only does he make fish climb trees, but also makes them climb down and do a 10-mile run. Tell me, school, are you proud of the things you've done? Turning millions of people into robots, do you find that fun? Do you realize how many kids relate to that fish swimming upstream in class, never finding their gifts, thinking they are stupid, believing they are useless? Well, the time has come, no more excuses. I call school to the stand and accuse him of killing creativity, individuality, and being intellectually abusive. He's an ancient institution that has outlived his usage. So, Your Honor, this concludes my opening statement, and if I may present the evidence of my case, I will prove it.
Proceed.
Exhibit A. Here's a modern day phone. Recognize it? Here's a phone from 150 years ago. Big difference, right? Stay with me. Here's a car from today, and here's a car from 150 years ago. Big difference, right? Well, get this. Here's a classroom of today, and here's a class we used 150 years ago. Now, ain't that a shame? In literally more than a century, nothing has changed. Yet you claim to prepare students for the future? But with evidence like that, I must ask, do you prepare students for the future or the past? I did a background check on you and let the record show that you were made to train people to work in factories, which explains why you put students in straight rows, nice and neat, tell them sit still, raise your hand if you want to speak, give them a short break to eat, and for 8 hours a day, tell them what to think. Oh, and make them compete to get an A letter which determines product quality, hence grade A of meat. I get it. Back then, times were different. We all have a past. I myself am no Gandhi. But today, we don't need to make robot zombies. The world has progressed, and now we need people who think creatively, innovatively, critically, independently, with the ability to connect. See, every scientist will tell you that no two brains are the same, and every parent with 2 or more children will confirm that claim. So please explain why you treat students like cookie cutter frames or snapback hats, giving them this one-size-fits-all crap.
Watch your language.
Sorry, Your Honor, but if a doctor prescribed the exact same medicine to all of his patients, the results will be tragic. So many people would get sick, yet when it comes to school, this is exactly what happens, this educational malpractice, where one teacher stands in front of 20 kids, each one having different strengths, different needs, different gifts, different dreams, and you teach the same thing the same way? That's horrific. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant should not be acquitted. This may be one of the worst criminal offenses ever to be committed. And let's mention the way you treat your employees.
Objection. Overruled. I want to hear this.
It's a shame. I mean, teachers have the most important job on the planet, yet they're underpaid? No wonder so many students are short-changed. Let's be honest. Teachers should earn just as much as doctors, because a doctor can do heart surgery and save the life of a kid, but a great teacher can reach the heart of that kid and allow him to truly live. See, teachers are heroes that often get blamed, but they're not the problem. They work in a system without many options or rights. Curriculums are created by policymakers, most of which have never taught a day in their life. just obsessed with standardized tests. They think bubbling in a multiple choice question will determine success. That's outlandish. In fact, these tests are too cruel to be used and should be abandoned, but don't take my word for it. Take Frederick J. Kelly, the man who invented standardized testing, who said, and I quote, "These tests are too cruel to be used and should be abandoned." Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if we continue down this road, the results will be lethal. I don't have much faith in school, but I do have faith in people. And if we can customize healthcare, cars, and Facebook pages, then it is our duty to do the same for education, to upgrade it, change it, do away with school spirit, because that's useless unless we're working to bring the spirit out of each and every student. That should be our task. No more Common Core. Instead, let's reach the core of every heart in every class. Sure, math is important, but no more than art or dance. Let's give every gift an equal chance. I know this sounds like a dream, but countries like Finland are doing impressive things. They have shorter school days, teachers make a decent wage, homework is non-existent, and they focus on collaboration instead of competition. But here's the kicker, boys and girls. Their educational system outperforms every other country in the world. Other places like Singapore are succeeding rapidly. Schools like Montessori, programs like Khan Academy, there is no single solution. But let's get moving, because while students may be 20% of our population, they are 100% of our future. So let's attend to their dreams, and there's no telling what we can achieve. This is a world in which I believe, a world where fish are no longer forced to climb trees. I'll rest my case.
So ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude today's session, I want to just bring you back to a few key points. As we think about our educational equity journey, I want you to continue to think about how you reflect upon your own journey, your beliefs, your biases that may impact how you lead for equity. Understand the impact of history and why equity gaps even exist. Knowing again that the system was never designed to be equitable. And so we're going to have to think about how do we interrupt those gaps and not perpetuate them. Know your equity gaps for your target student groups. So know your data with good data, multiple data, qualitative and quantitative. Define equity and student success. So actually have a working definition of what equity is, because it becomes the lens by which you do your work. It has to be a common understanding amongst all stakeholders who you're working with, and really defining what student success is beyond test scores. Have an actual equity impact plan. Again, have a real strategic focus on equity so that you stay the course despite all the changes in education. Continue to stay focused on a target student group that you can close the gap for and create a systemic change in that regard. And what can you do now in terms of equity right now? In this moment of distance learning, it is imperative that we provide professional learning for teachers and leaders to ensure that distance learning happens with this equity lens. We know that these couple of months will impact how education plays out in the long run. So it's important that professional learning happens, that we give our adults in schools the tools and strategies and support that they're going to need long before we can hold them accountable, because accountability is going to matter too. But we want to make sure support is in place so we can balance that with accountability to ensure that equity happens on behalf of our kids. So with that, educational leaders, I want to thank you for your willingness to share and reflect and grow with me today. I know that we couldn't have our interactive space, which is what I love to do with you. However, I want to wish you the best on your journey, and know that Nicole Anderson and Associates Consulting, LLC, is here to support you. I have a team of people who are ready and willing to support you on your educational equity journey. And with that, I want to say take care and stay encouraged.
Educational leaders, we cannot close the educational gaps that we see in our schools if we don't close the one in our minds first.